And good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And, pardon me, if my count is right, this is video number 20 in our review and refutation of the book by Mr. Kyle Pope entitled Thinking About AD 70. Now, this will be our final video in review and refutation of this book. That does not mean that there is not a bunch of stuff that I could address. I have to be very, very blunt at this point, and I want to be as respectful and kind as I possibly can. But the deeper I go into this book, the deeper that I have gone into this book, the more I have been utterly astounded at how uncritical, how illogical, how unbiblical Mr. Pope's position really is. I can tell you that as a fifth-generation member of the Churches of Christ, in the circles that I traveled in which I was raised, I never heard a whiff of a clue, of a hint, of a suggestion of any of the things that Mr. Pope sets forth. Now, does that prove that Mr. Pope is wrong? No, no, no. But what I am saying is that Mr. Pope's views stand outside, the normal tradition of the amillennialism in the Churches of Christ. Now, does that prove he's wrong? No, it most assuredly does not. I'm just simply saying that, as the old saying goes, powerful claims demand powerful proof, or something like that. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary proof, I believe is the more accurate quote. And thus, when I have read an awful lot of Mr. Pope's claims, I've literally shaken my head in amazement. He makes claims that really have no lexical support. And then when he comes, for instance, to the book of Revelation, he is, or so it seems to me, literally grasping at straws and completely and totally ignoring the consistency, for instance, again, of the book of Revelation with what Jesus and Paul said, and not to mention what they said in relationship to what the Old Testament said. So I want to just take note of a couple of final points that I have taken note of in my notes, and then I want to move on, and I want to summarize what we have seen. And I'm going to I'm going to try to make this as brief as possible. I could turn this into a 2-hour summary, to be honest about it. But on pages 101 and following, Mr. Pope addresses the issue of the Olivet Discourse. He takes note of the fact that Mark and Luke do not mention the coming of the Lord. When Jesus predicted the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, the apostles in Matthew asked, "Tell us, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" Well, Mr. Pope insists that the word parousia is always used of a personal coming, a personal, literal, visible coming of the Lord. Based upon that assumption, and listen, you will not find that in the lexicons. Can it have that meaning? Yes. Does it have that meaning in Matthew chapter 24? No, it does not. Does it have that meaning in reference to Christ's second coming throughout the New Testament? No, it doesn't. Christ's second coming, as I have said repeatedly, as I have written on it extensively in my book, like Father, like Son on clouds of glory. Jesus never promised to come back in a literal, physical, Jewish man's body at some proposed end of time. Now, don't forget, we're coming, down toward the close of the month of November 2021. But my 3-book special for November 2021, U.S. orders only, Like Father, Like Son on Clouds of Glory, my book, How Is This Possible? And this is just one of those areas in which Mr. Pope goes off the tracks. He acknowledges that the language of the coming of the Lord being at hand, etc., sounds like it's imminent, but it doesn't really mean that. Furthermore, he argues that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 2, Paul said to the Thessalonians, don't let anyone convince you that the day of the Lord is just at hand. He appeals to the King James translation, which I document in my book, How Is This Possible?, is an absolutely false translation. It is wrong. The proper translation is, don't let anyone convince you the day of the Lord is already present or has come and is present. Now, I addressed this issue in one of my videos. This is a humongous issue because I posed the question, if the word parousia always means a literal, visible, physical coming of the Lord, and if the brethren at Thessalonica, and Ephesus, by the way, believed it had already occurred, how could they believe that the day of the Lord, the parousia, was what Mr. Pope believes it to be, a personal, literal, visible, bodily coming of Christ at the so-called end of time when the earth and the cosmos is burned up? This is a powerful book. And then Dan Derry's book, The Meaning Behind the Manner, it's an exegesis of Acts chapter 1. Now, once again, if you purchase all of these books separately, paid separate shipping, you would pay well over $60. For the rest of November 2021, U.S. orders only, total delivered price, $39.95. Now, look, we're behind. They have not shipped my copies of Dan Derry's book, there you go, on time. And so we're running a little bit behind. We've got some of those on back order. They are due in hopefully next week early. And so please be patient with me, but we will most assuredly get your copies to you. Now then, a couple of things on the Olivet Discourse. When Jesus said, speaking of his coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, verily I say unto you, this generation will by no means pass until all of these things are fulfilled. Well, Mr. Pope informs us, actually in his discussion in Revelation, but he applies it obviously to Matthew 24:34. The word generation simply means, quote, a people, unquote. No, ladies and gentlemen, that is blatantly false. The word genos is the word for race, stock, people. That is not the word in Matthew 24:34. Perhaps Mr. Pope was confused. Genos is race, stock, people. Genea is generation. Furthermore, as Gary DeMar has pointed out so extremely well, and by the way, his article is on my website, donkpreston.com and bibleprophecy.com, in an exhaustive study of the term, this generation. Gary DeMar demonstrates from the lexicons, from the grammars, that this term, this generation, never refers to simply, quote, a people. Now consider this. In Matthew chapter 1, we have the delineation there of 42 generations. 14 generations from here to here, 14 generations from here to here, 14 generations, using the Greek word genea. Would Mr. Pope argue, well, that means that's 42 different kinds of people. How ridiculous would that be? No, no, no. As the lexicons point out, as the grammars point out, as the critical commentaries point out, the term this generation refers to all of the people, yes, people, but all of the people living at a given time. Mr. Pope's argument is nothing but argumentum ad desperatum. And it's based upon his preconceived idea that the Greek word parousia must refer to a literal, visible, physical, bodily coming of Jesus. Then, in order to escape further, on page 122, in Matthew 24:29, in discussing the fall of Jerusalem and the events leading up to it, Jesus said immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars of heaven will fall from the sky. Immediately after. Now, Mr. Pope knows that if you grant the definition of immediately to mean, immediately, then his entire eschatology falls to the ground. Period. His argument that parousia must refer to a literal, visible, bodily, physical coming of Christ is destroyed. So what does he do? Point number one, he admits that in the ministry of Jesus, it literally refers to the straightness of something, is often translated straightway. And although that generally involves something with little or no time interval between, that is not always true. So what is Mr. Pope setting us up for? Pardon me. He is setting us up for arguing, well, it's true that in the normal sense of euthios, there is no interval or gap of time between here and there. And let me point something out. The Greek word euthios is used 82 times in the New Testament. In the great bulk of times, and the great majority of times, it is used in reference to Jesus and his healing. In other words, when Jesus would touch someone and they were healed straightway, it doesn't mean they were healed 30 years later. 40 years later, 2,000 years later. Every single time euthios is used in reference to Jesus' healings, the individual was healed instantly. But what does Mr. Pope do? Well, he points out that in 3 John, verse 14, the word is translated as shortly. Okay. Does that mean in 2,000 years? No, it does not. Then he appeals. For example, he says, in the parable of the sower, the seed that fell on stony soil sprang up immediately. Matthew 13:5. Obviously, there would have to be some time interval between the time of sowing and when a plant could sprout. Matthew 25:15-16. Okay. So the seed is sown, immediately it springs up. Does that mean 2,000 years later it springs up? No. And Mr. Pope knows that's ridiculous. I'm confident he knows that's ridiculous. But what is he trying to do? What he's doing is, okay, I know, Mr. Pope admits, that in the majority of cases, euthios means immediately, just like the word means. But, Mr. Pope says, hey, look, I can find a couple of examples where it doesn't mean immediately, instantly, therefore, it can't mean that in Matthew 24:29. Ladies and gentlemen, That is an incredible example of illegitimate totality transfer. That is a logical fallacy that says, okay, it's defined this way, here, 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 and here. Oh, but wait, I found an exception to that over here. Therefore, all of these other instances are invalidated. And then, Mr. Pope completely changes the definition of euthios by appealing to Peter Lang in his commentary on the Holy Scriptures, who argues that euthios means suddenly, with rapidity of action. Ladies and gentlemen, it is not used that way in the Scripture. Now, he tries to argue and say, well, Jesus will speak of his second coming as sudden and immediate, like the coming of the flood of Noah's day. Well, number one, Jesus did not use euthios in these verses in Matthew 24, 37 to 39. And number two, he did not use parakrema, which means immediately. Jesus said, as it was in the days of Noah, they ate, they drank, they married, they gave in marriage, and they knew not until the flood came and took them all away. Now, let me ask you a question. Was the flood without warning? Was the flood sudden? Well, I mean, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, for crying out loud. Is that, quote, sudden? So you see, what Mr. Pope is trying to do is change the very definition of the word. What he is trying to tell us on the one hand is that euthios cannot be used in a sense to mean that it never allows for any time period between the events to which it refers. And yet, that's exactly what it means in regard to Jesus' miracles and his citation of two examples of a very, very short span between this event and that one does not allow for 2,000 years. Ladies and gentlemen, that's an abuse of the language. And then when he turns around and says, oh, well, it really doesn't mean next in order of occurrence. After all, it means suddenness of occurrence, whenever that might be. That's changing definitions in midstream, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, got to hurry here. Then we come to his discussion of the book of Revelation. And once again, I found so many of his comments to be not only less than convincing, but I found many of his comments to be incredibly misguided. He wants us to rely on the belief that Domitian demanded worship as a god. On page 141, he talks about the imperial cult in Asia Minor. And he wants us to pay attention to Eusebius and other writers who speak of Domitian. Now, since I'm in a formal written debate with Sergius Baal on the dating of Revelation, let me recommend that you simply go to my website and you look up the formal written debate on the dating of Revelation, in which I am addressing many of the things that Mr. Pope addresses. But what is amazing, he spends all this time talking about Rome being the city of seven hills. I don't know of anybody that denies that. That's not the point. The point is that the harlot, Babylon, rides the beast who sits on seven hills. The harlot, by the way, let me make this observation. As Professor Sebastian Smolars wrote, and I can give anyone the source that they want, pointing out that the word harlot, used in the Old Testament in 86 out of 91 occurrences, and in the vast majority of cases referring to Israel as the harlot. In 86 out of 91 occurrences refers to a wife, either literally, physically, or metaphorically, of Israel as Yahweh's wife, who committed adultery, violating the marriage vow. Well, in Revelation, the harlot, Babylon is called the harlot. And Revelation, almost more than any book of the New Testament, draws on the Old Testament more than any of them. So here we have Revelation calling this city the harlot, and he's drawing from the Old Covenant language more than any other book. And we're supposed to believe that that John, in writing Revelation, is calling Rome the harlot in a way virtually unknown in the Bible. Virtually unknown. Now, was it possible for the word harlot to be used outside of a marital infidelity context? Well, yeah. Genesis chapter 17 uses the word there. But again, in 86 out of 91 cases, it refers to an unfaithful wife. And by the way, that's the way it is used in the book of Revelation. And then he talks about the figure of Babylon, and he goes through Revelation 14, Revelation 16, Revelation 17. And again, he completely overlooks covenantal language. In Revelation chapter 16, verse 19, we are told that Babylon was remembered before God. Well, what Mr. Pope completely overlooks or ignores is that the word remembered in Scripture, although it can mean simple mental recall, when God remembered someone or something, it was in the context of His covenant. So when God remembered Babylon, He was bringing to mind His covenant with Babylon. Now, Mr. Pope would have to answer, what covenant did God have with Rome? He didn't. God was never in a covenant relationship with Rome. And listen, there's so much. Literally, there is so much here that I do not have time to address it all. But let me see if I can kind of count the pages here very, very quickly. 137 through 164. He tries to convince his readers that Babylon of Revelation was Rome. Now, by the way, one of the things that he does is he talks about the use of the word Babylon or the figure of Babylon outside of Revelation, if I remember correctly reading that. It's been a while since I read that chapter on Revelation. Here's the point. Ladies and gentlemen, and I point this out in my book, Who is this Babylon? If someone, I won't accuse Mr. Pope of doing that since my memory is failing me as to whether or not he specifically makes this claim, but many people try to say, well, the Jews, they referred to Rome as Babylon. That's correct. However, what those same people failed to note, either on purpose or ignorantly, is that the Jews did not begin to call Rome Babylon until after AD 70. After Rome destroyed Jerusalem. Furthermore, the book of Revelation was not written by non-Christian Jews. It was written by a Jewish Christian with a distinctively Jewish Christian perspective, not a purely non-Christian Jewish perspective. But here perhaps is one of the most glaring omissions in his entire discussion. All of those pages trying to convince us that Rome was Babylon. Point number one, he completely distorts, and I would say perverts, the consistency of the testimony of Jesus, of Paul, and of Revelation, in saying that Jesus and Paul said it was Jerusalem that killed the prophets, just like John said Jerusalem, Babylon, had killed the prophets. Just like Jesus said it was Jerusalem that was going to kill him, Paul said the same thing. And this is where Mr. Pope goes totally silent. Unless I completely missed it, Mr. Pope has not one word to say about the fact that Babylon in Revelation was the city, quote, where the Lord was crucified, unquote. But then he comes to Jesus' declaration that it was to be Jerusalem that would kill his apostles and prophets. And it's not possible for a prophet to perish outside of Jerusalem, Luke 11:49 and following. He completely ignores the testimony of Paul, who said that it was Jerusalem that had killed the prophets and Jesus' apostles and prophets, and completely distorts the reality of the fact that it was Babylon that was killing the apostles and prophets of Jesus. Ladies and gentlemen, how do you so grossly overlook this perfect, consistent, harmonious testimony and say, and by the way, he gives so very, very little attention to what Jesus and Paul said. How do you divorce Revelation from that consistent, harmonious, unified testimony, which, by the way, is not just Jesus? It starts in Deuteronomy 32. And a final thought. In Revelation chapter 19, verse 2 and 3, in the song of victory that is sung at the destruction of Babylon, the victory song is sung, God has avenged on her the blood of his saints. Throughout this series of videos, I have shared with you that Deuteronomy 32 tells us twice that it was about Israel's last end. And in Israel's last days, God would avenge the blood of his saints. Deuteronomy 32:43. And when God would avenge on Israel the blood of his saints, all the nations would rejoice with God's people, i.e. the elect. What do we find in Revelation? In Revelation, we have the judgment of the city, quote, where the Lord was crucified, unquote. And again, about which Mr. Pope says not one word. Why? Well, it's because it's fatal to his entire paradigm. But at the destruction of that city where the Lord was crucified, John and the angels of heaven sing a song of victory, quoting from Deuteronomy 32:43, and says it was fulfilled in the destruction of Babylon. Okay, so Deuteronomy 32 foretold that in Israel's last days, God would avenge the blood of the martyrs. That's in his judgment on Jerusalem and Israel. In Revelation, in the destruction of Babylon, the city that killed the prophets, Jesus, and Jesus' apostles and prophets, Deuteronomy 32:43 is said to be fulfilled. And yet, Mr. Pope wants us to believe Revelation had nothing to do with John's contemporary time. It is about the destruction of Rome that would not happen for 450, or, rounded off 400 years. So what have we seen in this series? We have seen that Mr. Pope says the law, the entirety of the Old Covenant, was nailed to the cross. We have seen that the foundation of his doctrine, the foundation of his entire book, really, in many senses, is that God was through with Old Covenant Israel at the cross. And yet, strangely, paradoxically, and self-contradictorily, Mr. Pope constantly quotes from Old Testament prophecies to confirm his doctrine of a yet future coming of the Lord at the so-called and imaginary end of time. So on the one hand, he tells us the old law was completely annulled, and he told us a law or a covenant that has been annulled cannot be applied any further. And yet, he tells us the old covenant was annulled, and then turns right around and quotes from Isaiah 65, Isaiah 66, Ezekiel 37, Ezekiel 40 to 47, to speak of a supposed yet future eschaton. That is a fatally false contradiction. It undermines every single thing in Mr. Pope's book. Okay, thank you so much for joining me here on this Friday on my morning musings. Now, I'm going to take a break from my Friday morning musings for the next 2 or 3 weeks, perhaps a month. I don't know yet. I'm involved in a whole ton of research right now, trying to bring one of my books entitled The Last Day, The Last Hour, The Last Trumpet Resurrection. I'm trying to get a bunch done on that. I'm involved in this formal written debate with Mr. Sergius Bale. But here's what my plan is. When I pick up on my Friday morning responding to the critic sections, work, I'm going to be addressing N.T. Wright. And I guess if you were going to entitle those videos, it would be Why Right is Wrong. A little humor there. I got to tell you, N.T. Wright is one of my very favorite writers right now. I absolutely love his writings. But his eschatology is self-contradictory. And so I'm going to be examining 1 or 2 of his recent videos. I'm going to be analyzing them, breaking them down, and demonstrating where N.T. Wright contradicts himself, but most importantly, contradicts Scripture in regard to the coming of the Lord. All right? Thanks again for joining me. You have a fantastic weekend. Be safe. I'll see you on Monday.